Live. We're possibly live. We're live. What are we going to do? We have to talk about something interesting.
Yeah, seems like once you push that button, then you get into this weird mode.
It's
Like,
time to
oh no, oh
perform.
no, oh no.
Well, I want to talk with you about the Grim Reaper
So
paradox.
wait. You can't get away with that. You have to
Okay,
say,
hold on. So I have to share this link.
I was gonna say, aren't you gonna share your link at least?
Okay,
You said you don't know how to share the link before we actually go live. So that means we have to share the link while we're live. You have to
okay.
share it to somebody.
Okay,
And I know the people who are in your Facebook list, your friends list, they would like this video because this is talking about, stuff that your audience likes.
okay, I want to share it with my main Facebook.
Yeah.
What should I call it? Talking with my wife, Rachel.
About the Grim Reaper paradox.
The Grim Reaper paradox. Okay, what's going to happen? Are people going to come watch this? That's the question.
We'll see.
Okay. Yeah. So
do you actually have your YouTube open so that you can see comments on stuff?
that's the question. Anybody can ask a question.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
Back then.
Hi. What happened to you?
Hi. I disappeared.
Why? What happened to you?
I think it was an internet glitch.
Oh, weird. Was I also gone?
No, you're always there.
Oh.
Okay, so Rachel, help me to think about the Grim Reaper paradox. Okay, so I was thinking about this. And I was thinking about the stakes. Okay, you can help me set this up. But I was thinking what's at stake is how old reality is. All right. Now, there's two options. Either reality is finitely old, so it like existed for a finite time, or it's infinitely old. So those are the only options, right? I mean, either finitely old or infinitely old. I guess you could say, or it has no time at all. There's like time is an illusion. But then that would be finitely old. That'd be zero time. Okay. It's timeless, I guess. Okay. Now, if it's finitely old, that's weird because then it looks like maybe the universe, the reality, all of reality began a finite time ago.
What do you mean by reality?
Just whatever exists. Whatever there is. Like you're real, I hope. I'm real.
Because asking how long ago the universe started and asking how old reality is are two very different questions.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to do it in terms of reality because sometimes people think like, well, maybe the universe had a beginning and then you imagine something produced the universe, like maybe God or something produced the universe. But then that actually can distract your mind from almost like this more basic question, like put God to the side, put the types of realities to the side and just think of all of reality, like whatever it is, like whatever it is, either it existed for finite time or infinite time. Like those are the options. And if it existed for finite time, there's kind of this weird thing about like, well, how did it start? Like even if God existed there at the beginning, how did God start? And you say, well, God didn't start. Well, then that would be the idea that reality has existed for infinite time. Okay, so the Grim Reaper argument, I want to just test this out. I want you to help me to sort of figure out what I'm missing. Help me to sort of think about it in the way that, I don't know, like help me to find my flaws and my mistakes, because I've changed my thinking about the age of reality or how long.
The hurdles of thought.
Yeah.
That somebody might have when they're thinking about it.
Yeah. So just for simplicity, let's imagine that the idea that reality is infinitely old. I'm going to translate that as, because there's different ways of thinking of time, I'm going to just translate that as there's been an infinite series of past events. Okay. And for many years, and you know about this.
An infinite series, so they couldn't have gone in parallel. At least there's one infinite series.
Yeah, at least one. Like think dominoes.
There could be parallel lines, but at least there's one. There's at least one infinite series of events.
Yeah.
And
So you could
then that
imagine some sequence of dominoes.
yeah. You have to have some metaphysics of events such that they can be in a series or in a
Yeah.
sequence.
Yeah.
So
This is
that's
kind of like when I was asking Micah when he was like 8 years old or something
Mhm.
about the escalators. We came up an escalator and I said, Micah, if that escalator had no bottom, could somebody named Fred successfully get to the top of that escalator? And you ask him, Fred, how long have you been traveling? And he says, for forever. I've been traveling up this escalator forever. But finally, I've come to my destination.
Right.
So that would be an example of an infinite series of
Mhm.
times, events to get to the top.
Mhm.
Okay, so there's this question about whether there could be an infinite series. And when I was in graduate school, I thought it was maybe a little weird that there could be an infinite series. It seems sort of weird. Like, how do you finish coming up that escalator without ever starting? That just seemed weird. But I thought, but if you never start, then that's precisely how you would be able to finish the infinite series, is because you don't start. Because if you don't start, you can go through the infinite number. And it's just weird, but that's just weird. But that's
Well,
okay.
yeah, and then you have the idea of the super task so that you can start and then you can finish. But that's a different that we're talking about theoretically, could you even I mean, basically we're really asking, is it coherent to think that something doesn't start?
Right.
I mean,
But
really,
finishes.
but finishes, yeah.
Yeah. I
Something
mean,
that,
even in a super task, you could set it up so like there's no first, there's an infinite number of events in finite time. So there's a time before the super task started, but there might be like no first
yeah, you just have that
event,
open circle, that open
open
circle.
interval. Yeah.
Yeah, you do
Okay.
all these tricks in math, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. So math, it seems like, allows us to talk about infinity. And
Mhm.
because of that, I didn't really have this deep problem with infinity. I just thought it was weird. And I would read these different articles that would kind of draw out the weirdness. Like, so there's
Mhm.
articles about Hilbert's Hotel, where you've got this infinite hotel. It's completely filled with people. Every room has a person, but then you can make room for more people. If there's infinite time, you could allow this infinite construction of a hotel. Let's say more people come in, you just move everybody down a room and you can fill in this hotel with more people. Even though it was already filled, you can always add more people. And I thought that was weird, but then I thought that's just the weirdness of infinity. Okay,
Yeah.
that's kind of how I was thinking about it. But then Alex Pruss, he posted this puzzle on the Pros Blogion. This was this online blog. And he made this argument that if you could have an infinite past, then not only could you get something weird, you could get something contradictory. And
Mhm.
this is what the Grim Reaper paradox is, which we've
Wait,
talked about.
wait, you're saying
Yes.
Alex Proust was saying that you can get something contradictory?
Yeah. If you could have an infinite past, you can deduce a contradiction. This
Okay,
idea.
so okay, for some reason I thought that you were saying that you were the one who was originating this. Now you're saying that it was Alexander Proust that was originating that idea.
Okay. So Alex. Okay. So
I
there's
hope I'm
different.
following you.
Yes.
You use a lot of pronouns, so it's hard for me to really like keep track of like what you're talking about.
Yeah. It's confusing. I'm still learning how to speak English. That's why I need you to help me.
Okay,
This
go
is,
ahead, go
this is
ahead.
my problem.
Go ahead.
Yeah. And I would say things with like double negation. I would say that's not the case, that I didn't say that. And that's confusing as
Yeah.
well.
Okay,
So
okay. So anyway, was my translation correct or was it incorrect?
yeah, okay. So it was correct. So Alex Pruss
Okay,
had this argument that you could tease out a contradiction from an
okay,
infinite past.
okay.
Okay. But then the question is, how do you tease out that contradiction? And there's different ways. So Robert Koons then later came out with an article. And before he did, Pruss, Koons, and I, we were in a three-way email exchange talking about this paradox and coming up with different formulations. So Koons published an article on this. Proust has a whole book on infinity where he develops this. And so I've been thinking more about this lately because my friend Alex Malpaz, he's been arguing about this or critiquing this kind of argument. It's caused me to think more about, can you deduce a contradiction from an infinite past?
Mm-hmm.
And so as I've been thinking about this, I came up with a principle, because like I said, there's different ways you might argue for contradiction, but I came up with a principle, and I want to sort of test this out on you, see if you find this intuitive, if this works. Okay, so here's my deduction of a contradiction. I'm going to try to give this sort of quick version of it, and then we can always add more details. But imagine there could be an infinite sequence of dominoes that leads to this final domino. Okay, then what I want to do is I want to transform each of those dominoes in finite ways so that I can come up with a scenario that will be contradictory. Okay. All right. So here's how I'm going to do it. So imagine these dominoes, they transform from dominoes to machines. Okay. Now that's a finite difference because these aren't infinite machines. These are each finite machines.
Okay.
And then each machine will have a clock inside of it. And that clock will, it's actually a timer. And each machine will it'll have a random timer that will decide when that machine is going to do something very interesting.
So wait, did you have an infinite series of dominoes, like at any particular density or spacing or any particular size, or doesn't matter?
Let's say they're 1 inch, each 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch.
Okay.
And let's say they're separated by an inch.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
And let's say the first scene, you can imagine they've been falling from all of eternity, and then finally at the present time, you see the final domino like hits the ground.
Okay.
That's like our first scenario.
The final is in, it ends at your present, you index, you t-index.
Yeah, the one that's like next to you, like you're looking at it and you're like, they're saying, Josh, come over here, look at this. This last domino is about to fall over.
Okay.
And it's very exciting because this has been happening
for all of eternity. Yeah. Okay. Okay, got it.
So we finally arrived. Okay. So now just change those dominoes into little machines. Imagine that each machine has a timer.
Yeah.
And the timer is randomized.
A timer or a like a clock. Clock like that says a time, or like an actual timer is like counting down. Sorry, I just want to be clear. Stopwatch?
Yeah, no, I appreciate this. So
it's going up or it's going down?
Well, so the reason why I'm hesitating is because I'm thinking I want to just go like step by step. So we can start with clocks, because you can kind of visualize the clocks, and then transform the clocks into like a stopwatch.
Okay.
And then
stopwatches usually go up, like the timer, you push start and then it goes up like 1, 2, 3, like that.
Could it be like one that goes down?
Okay. Okay, you can call that a timer. Call that a timer.
It's a timer, and it's going to count down to 0, and its initial time will be randomized.
You can do that with a stopwatch too. Just let's clarify our terms so that we don't get confused.
Thank you for helping me with it. So okay, so imagine that each of these starts with some initial timer, and that they're all counting down. So like maybe let's label the dominoes. Let's say we've got domino 1, which is like the closest one to you, domino 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way out through all the natural numbers.
Now are all of the timers set at the same amount of time? Like, for example, are they all set at like 1 hour so that they all count backwards from an hour, or are they all set at different times?
They're all going to be set at different times.
Okay.
And it'll be randomized. So it might be that domino 1 is set at like 30 minutes. Domino 2 is set at 2 hours. And they're just going to count down. And then when they reach 0, well, these aren't dominoes anymore. They're machines. Okay. And when they reach 0, what they'll do is they're going to check to see if there's just this like blue Lego, and they're going to check to see if that Lego is blue. And if it's blue, then if it's not already blue, then they're going to paint it blue. Put some paint on there. But the Lego, let's say, is already blue, and let's say that this Lego has been existing also from eternity.
Right.
Okay. And here my thought is it's again this idea that if you could have an eternal thing that's like dominoes, then you could have another eternal thing like this blue Lego.
Yeah.
Okay. So each domino, so what it'll do is when its timer comes down to 0, it'll check to see, is that blue? If it's blue, do nothing. If it's not blue, paint it blue. Okay. So far there's like no.
All the domino machines from eternity past have these timers that are randomly set. So we don't know, like, is there a range of the time to take?
It could be anything, anything
like,
number.
To multiple years, to like multiple seconds, like, anything at all.
It could be, there's no range except that it's got to be each timer, the time will be greater than 0, and it will be any finite number. No time could be infinite, because I want to make sure it's clear each of these machines is finite. And the only changes I'm making from scenario to scenario is it's going to be finite changes to these machines. So that's it.
Yeah, got it.
Okay. So now let's just imagine that just by random chance, the timers form the following series. Timer number 1, or machine number 1, its timer is set such that it's going to check this blue Lego at midnight tonight. Okay. And then number 2 will check at 11:30, and number 3 will check at 11:15. Number 4 will check at 11:07 and 30 seconds. Number 5 will check at half of that.
Yeah.
And then we'll just keep cutting it in half
11:03
all the way out.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
All the way out, as in all the way back to the never approaching 11 p.m.
Yes. And there's no first machine here. So all the way out just means that each machine is closer and closer to 11.
So you're just basically arranging all the time. You're basically setting all the timers from infinity past to be in this particular sequence.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So now, so far, there's still no problem, because what happens is at 11 o'clock, these things are going to be checking. Just past 11. Nobody's going to check at 11, right? Because they get closer and closer to 11, but none of them check at 11. But as soon as 11 hits, right after that, these things are all checking, and they check all the way up to midnight. So
these are basically timers that are synchronized with our present clock.
Yeah.
So you imagine somebody who has some sort of a remote device, they can like access all of the timers, because you imagine that all the timers from infinite past have already been doing their operations, right? So it's only in the present moment when you're observing that blue block that you can say, okay, I want to do a new experiment. So you're going to use your controller, and you can push one button, and it somehow sets the timers. It resets all of them into this infinite sequence. And then you hit go, like, you can set them all up so that all the timers are doing nothing until it hits 11 o'clock, and then it goes, right? So you can actually do that from your present moment.
I have like a remote controller.
Yeah. You push a button. And you might say that might not be possible if you can't do an infinite number of tasks in one present moment. But I mean, I think that would be hard to question for most people, I think. So,
so I want to have the minimal assumptions possible. So I don't even want to assume that I could affect all of them. The only thing that I want to assume is that if you could have this infinite sequence, then you could have finite changes to each element in the sequence. That's all that I want to say. So imagine you could have some infinite sequence, and then I'm just trying to build this scenario through finite changes. So I'm saying, well, each one is a machine, each one has a clock, each clock is randomly set.
You could have a time traveling person who goes back and sets all the timers, and they just go back and set them,
But they'll never finish. That takes too long.
So how do we set? I mean, maybe
how do we get it set up?
How are we going to set the timers? This is the problem right here. I mean, the thing is how did you ever set you imagine that if they were all randomly set, then you don't need someone to set them. But actually there's some causal chain that was causing those timers to be set. So I guess it's like, once you bring in the intentionality, we're going to set all the timers into some, coherent logical order that we pick, like by design, then how do you actually set all those timers?
Okay. That's good. All right. So I'm going to introduce a character. See, this is why I need you to help me to fill out the details, get this clear. So I don't know. There's this guy named Bob, and he's sort of an interesting character. He likes to do funny things. He's like a mad philosopher. And so he wants to set this up. So what Bob does, Bob has been existing forever. And Bob sets, he's the one who's created each of these machines throughout infinite time. So here's kind of like the thought. If there could be something that's infinitely old, then there could be something that's been doing something from infinite time. And so now I'm introducing Bob as a device or something that can be a mechanism that can then set basically Bob creates each of the machines, and he's been creating these machines from eternity past. Obviously, he never started.
So as long as Bob never started, as long as he didn't start with setting the timer at 12,
he could finish.
So as long as
that's like coming up the escalator and finishing.
Yeah. Yes. So as long as it's in the present moment that he set the last timer to 12,
that's it.
Then that is where he will have no difficulty finishing his job.
Yes.
So as long as he does it in the right order. So he had to know from eternity past that he was going to do this sequence.
Well, maybe he didn't know. It was just random. He was behaving randomly.
Well, that would be really hard. How could he do something so systematic for so long?
It would seem unlikely that he would do something like this, right? Okay. And I'm glad you mentioned this, because I wanted to emphasize that I'm only suggesting that this is a logical possibility so far.
Yeah.
Let me clarify. If there could be an infinite past, then this would be a logical possibility. And by logical possibility, I mean it doesn't contradict any principle of reason. And by principle of reason, I mean some truth that you can sort of see it to be true a priori, or through this sort of sense of reason, sort of in the way that you can see that 2 + 2 = 4. You can see that a square circle is not a logical possibility if you can see that being a square precludes being a circle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I wanted to emphasize that because sometimes people think in terms of other notions of possibility, and I'm just talking about logical possibility. And the argument is that if there could be an infinite past, then each of these finite changes would be logically possible. That's the idea. So it would be logically because the whole question is, could there be an infinite past where you finish this infinite sequence? I'm saying, well, if there could be, then you could set up the dominoes. Mm-hmm. And you could set up, so far there's no problem, but it's the next part that's going to get
because basically you have an infinite amount of time to do an infinite number of finite tasks.
Yes.
So there should be no problem with that if you assume that the past is infinite, because you already are assuming that inside the infinite past there are an infinite number of finite events inside those times, if you want to think of it as implied, right? So inside those times, there already are finite causal powers at play doing something. So you're just saying, well, why couldn't one of those things that they're doing is just setting the time of timer?
Exactly. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. That's good. Okay. Now this is where the weird part comes in. Okay. So Bob has set this up, and he knows what's going to happen. So there's this, it was blue, right? Help me remember.
Yeah,
it was blue. It was a blue thing, and they're going to check to see if it's blue. So those details, like the colors, I just lose sight of them.
I know. And then you start using pronouns, and then everyone else starts losing track too.
This is like what we were saying earlier today about how it seems like I would have a certain maybe confidence that I have something of value to offer.
Yeah.
And then like bother me, like if people don't really see what I'm saying, they're like, well, no, I have something to say. And then you were saying that it'd almost be like the other way, like you wouldn't be bothered if people don't really like see what you're saying or agree with you or whatever. But then you maybe have more of a question about whether what you're saying actually has value or something. And then the truth might be the opposite, that you actually have value and then you're humble about it. Okay. So let me go back to the scenario. So we're coming to a contradiction. So the mad philosopher, Bob, he sees what's about to happen after 11. is there's going to be this quick checking,
Yeah.
and it's going to check to see if the Lego is blue, and if the Lego is already blue, it'll do nothing. Okay,
Yeah.
so he knows that
And
if he leaves,
you can say that, just to clarify, you can say that he even puts into their 11 o'clock on this day in the future. Like he's calculated it all out, like he picks a day, because
yes,
given that it was an infinite past, it doesn't really matter which day he picked.
which day? It could be next Saturday.
Yeah, it could be
I was
any
thinking it's
any day.
tonight. It's tonight.
Okay, tonight. Okay, at
Yes.
11 p.m. Okay, got it. So
Yeah.
he sets that into his timer that it's going to be on this day. Okay, got
Yeah.
it. Okay.
So and he knows that after 11 o'clock, because that Lego's blue, all the machines will do nothing. They'll just
They'll
check
do
if it's blue. They'll just do, there's no problem. But then he gets this crazy idea. He's like, well, what would happen if I change the color of the Lego before 11? So he paints,
Right.
he gets out his paints, he paints it red.
Yeah.
Now it's red. Okay.
Now
So
it's
what's
red.
going to happen at 11
So
o'clock?
now
What's going to
he's
happen,
wondering,
Rachel?
what's going to happen? What's going to happen?
Yeah. What will happen? What do you think will happen?
So then basically what you have is the one that has its timer at 12. It will check whether the block is blue.
Yeah.
But the thing is that it was red before 11 o'clock. So
right.
The thing is that if it were red before 11 o'clock, then one of the machines prior would have already painted it red. So, it won't probably paint it red because it already will be. It won't paint
Wait,
it
hold
blue
on.
because
Before 11, wait, just to clarify, I want to make sure.
Yeah.
So before 11, it's red.
Before 11, it's red.
And then after 11,
they're
all
all
these
gonna
things are
check.
going to work to make it blue. Yes.
It's all going to be blue. So the one at 12, it will check, but it will already be blue because one of the previous machines will have already painted it blue.
That's right.
So we already know that. So the one at 11:30, the same thing. There's one before it that would have already completed the task of painting it blue.
That's
But
right.
then because you go back and back and back and there's no first machine, then the question is, which machine is it that actually paints the block blue?
And none of them, because for every machine, if it paints it blue, then there was already a machine before it, like you were saying, that would have already checked to see that it was red and would have already made it blue.
So then you have this weird line in
because
your
there's no first machine
graph. You have this dotted line, this like asymptotic graph or whatever. Like you have this line and it's dotted. Nothing, before that line is the block is red, and then after the line it's blue. But there is nothing that caused it to change.
Yes.
Nothing.
Yes. Okay. So now what can we say about this, right? Some people have said maybe it wasn't any particular machine that did the event. It's like all of them together. So in this infinite case, it's sort of like, as long as you have that open interval where you've got no first one, they all just sort of operate.
It's just like collective human action, like no human actually does anything.
No human elected a president. It's like the collective somehow.
Well, it's like the collective actually just, did something so that, there was someone elected president, but, no particular human being did anything, none of them did anything like vote or anything, because it was just the collective that took action, apart from individuals, right? But then it seems like, well, that doesn't really correspond with how we think. Like even when you talk about like brain states, talk about like neurons firing or something, it's like, like there might be some form of a collective action, like of a system, but you can't say that there's nothing that takes action. Otherwise you would have to doubt that there even is a causal connection between your thought and your brain state, right?
Like the parts themselves are doing, the reason the collective is doing something is because the parts are doing
something, right? So that's where you get the emergentism.
Yeah.
Like if the parts are doing something, maybe what they're doing isn't enough, but this other action that is over and above any of the particular actions of the parts, that can occur. But it seems like if you have no action from the parts, then it seems like I would suspect, at least, like how could you how could you
have
even
an
call that,
emergent action.
how could you even call that emergent action? Because it seems
Yeah.
it's not emerging from any, it's
Well, but
emerging.
okay. But in the Grim Reaper case, all of the Grim Reapers are acting. So like those are the parts. Oh, okay, I'm calling them Grim
Yeah, but
Reapers
then
now.
that's the thing,
The
is that they're
machines, the
not act,
machines. Yes.
they, how could they act? Because they only act if they check in the
Right.
previous one.
That's right. Yeah, well, that is exactly. None of them should be acting because
So
they
it's like,
only
it's
act.
like gridlock. It's like LA traffic. It's like everyone's just wanting to go somewhere, but they can't because it's also stuck.
Yeah. Well, and I was also thinking that I like that. That's a good example there. I was also thinking similar to that is that if they all act together, like when do they all act? Because
Yeah,
the same problem is relocated in terms of the time. Like you check, do they all act at 11:30?
right.
Like when does it get painted, right? Well,
At
it's not at 11:30
11:15,
because it would have
at
already happened.
11:07,
Right. It would have
at
already happened. It would have
11:03,
already
at
happened.
11:01. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So I don't think
Um,
that really solves
so
it. Yeah.
so the thing is that just talking in terms of if someone is scientifically inclined at all, they're going to object to this whole thing and say, well, you could never even set this up because there's this thing called Planck's constant. And that means that there's a Planck length and there's a Planck time. Like there is no time interval that could be shorter than Planck's time.
Yeah.
It means that once you set those dominoes, to a certain density, like you couldn't set another one close next to it, like in terms of its time, you couldn't adjust the time to a fine-tuned enough time in order to really get that infinite series. It would be like, you
Right.
finely tune that timer back and back and back and back, and suddenly there's a point where it just has to go in chunks, chunk. And so then that would mean that you would eventually go past the 11 o'clock, and if you just kept adding,
Yeah.
keep going back and
There's
back.
like these atomic times.
Yeah,
They're
it
the
has
smallest
to be-
times.
Yeah, so then it has to be, it looks infinite from where we're standing, but then when you actually get down to the nitty-gritty details, it would be that there is a point such that
You
can't
can't
have
get
a smaller
smaller.
time.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. Well,
then,
this is
then you would
why.
say that then you can't actually have those infinite clocks packed into that finite time, just in the physical sense. In the physical sense of our reality, you couldn't pack those things together.
Yes. This is okay.
So,
That's good. That's helpful. So this is why I was thinking in terms of logical consistency or logical possibility. So the
mhm,
idea is, yeah, maybe there are some constraints within our physical universe, right? But then the idea is that these constraints aren't purely logical constraints. So the argument is that if there could be an infinite past, then there's no logical constraint or logical contradiction or inconsistency in setting this up where things get smaller and smaller and smaller
mhm,
without limit. And then the reason why this is an interesting puzzle is that it seems like the result is a logical inconsistency. The logical inconsistency at the end is that this Lego gets painted at some time, but there's no time at which it gets painted.
right. Yeah.
And so we have to avoid this contradiction unless, see, another answer we could give, and I was thinking about this the other day. This is like an answer nobody gives. But you might wonder why not. You might say, you know what, there's actually no problem with contradictions when it comes to infinity. Okay, so I was thinking about, like, in my old days when I was younger, when I was so much younger and less wise, I thought about infinity. I thought, okay, there's a lot of weird paradoxes, but maybe that's just part of the weirdness of infinity, right? But why don't we say the same thing about contradictions? Why don't we say, contradictions are weird. We're not ordinarily bumping into square circles because those would seem to imply contradictions. Those are weird.
Mhm.
But maybe when it comes to infinity, contradictions are they're also weird there, but that's just part of the weirdness of infinity. And so there can't be finite contradictions, but there could be. If you could have an infinite in this infinite sequence, then you could generate a contradiction, and that's possible. That's really is possible, and there's no problem there. But I think the reason why people aren't saying that is because it seems like the difference between finite and infinite is not relevant to the impossibility of a contradiction. it seems like contradictions are just impossible. I mean, if there's some weird exception, then we need some special reason to think that that exception is actually the case. But if we don't have that reason.
And the thing is too, is that you can't just say that, like for example, Josh, I need to make a rule so that you do not create a square circle. Because if you did create a square circle, there would be a contradiction.
Right.
It's like that's not how contradictions work, right? So it has nothing to do with my action that blocks or prevents you from doing something contradictory. It's like, no, like the contradictory thing just can't happen.
Can't happen.
It just doesn't make sense. And so because of that, then you can't say that, because this scenario of setting up these machines with these timers, because it ends up with this logical scenario where it leads to a contradiction, that the block is painted blue and then it's not painted blue, like that both of those are true at some point, right? Like, oh, well, then that just means that I have to make a rule. You cannot take all of the infinite timers from all those machines and set them into that sequence. Like, I have to make a rule to prevent you from doing that, because otherwise it would lead to a contradiction.
Yes.
Like, no. Like, that just doesn't make sense. Like, that's not how contradictions work. It's like either that scenario is possible, in which case it's actually not contradictory. Like, there is actually an answer. Like, how does it get painted red? Well, there is an answer. How does it get painted blue? I mean, or if there really isn't an answer and it's both blue and not blue or something, then that means that there's a problem with the assumptions going in.
That seems right. I mean, this reminds me of the other objection that I've been thinking a lot about, which is that the problem with the scenario just is that it's contradictory. The problem isn't with the infinity of the past. The problem is that it's a contradiction. And then what I'm hearing you say here is that, well, it's not like they're,
we have to give
Bob.
We have to give Bob a rule. Bob, you can't set the time.
Bob, don't do that. Yeah. Or let's say Bob's already set it up in the benign case. There's no contradiction yet. And then Bob's thinking, should I paint this Lego red or should I just leave it blue?
Don't do that, Bob. Don't do that.
Don't do it. It'll make a contradiction. You can't do that. Yeah. It's like, it's too late. If there could be an infinite past, he's already in position to be able to do this thing that is impossible. And the reason that he can't, this is how I'm thinking about it. The reason I think that Bob can't do that is not that if there were an infinite past, then the law of non-contradiction forbids him from doing that. It's rather that the possibility of an infinite past entails, through this recombination possibility, that Bob can do something that's impossible. But then since Bob can't do something that's impossible, that's a contradiction. It follows that there can't be this infinite past.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. I think, so here's where I feel like the conversation could become a little bit more interesting and practical in terms of like,
help us move this conversation
forward. Because it feels like it gets stuck, right? It feels like it gets stuck then, right? So how can you move forward? Well, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is, what is infinity? What does it mean to be infinite, right? So one thing that they taught us, like Math 101, when you first start learning about infinities, is that infinity is not a number. But then we so easily just change, change in and out, like there's 1,000 days. Oh, there's 1,000,000 days. No, there's
infinitely many.
Yeah, right. There's infinity days. It's like, okay, no. That it's actually not a number. Infinity is not a number. If you can understand that infinity is not a number, then you can say, well, what is it? I mean, you can.
But what do you mean by a number? I mean,
well, then you could
call it a cardinality. Like there's a cardinality of an infinite set.
So you could ask yourself, what is a number? But let's just say that you assume that you know what a number is. It's the thing that we use to count and to quantify. Let's just say that you're not going to get into that metaphysical rabbit trail right now. And let's just say that you are instead very curious and pondering, what is this thing called infinity? And how is it related to numbers that we use to quantify things? Well, there's something that's very interesting to me, which is that, when you're drawing graphs and you're doing all these, calculus, like I was doing that like professional. I was a professional at solving, partial differential equations.
I remember that when we were dating, and I was very impressed because
integrals.
math was always my favorite subject, and yet you were doing math that I had never done before.
Integrate over these, wave functions and things, so yeah, like I was learning how to use that system, right? And a lot of times what you do is you integrate from 0 to infinity or something like that, right? So like, what does that even mean, right? So it's interesting because math, you can draw pictures, you can draw representations, you can draw these curved lines, or you can draw these dotted lines. Like I said earlier, you can draw that asymptotic dotted line that's just this line. Then you draw this other thing that approaches it, this curve that approaches it, and then you draw that little arrow.
The arrow.
Convenient little arrow.
That's right.
That says.
What does that mean? It means it goes up forever.
It goes up forever.
Yes.
Right.
In your mind, I guess.
You don't have to think about it anymore.
Right.
So the thing that's very interesting about that, and the reason why I think I would have a lot of trouble these days arguing with people about some of these philosophical puzzles, is that I don't even know if infinity is really comparable to numbers, like in that same way.
Yeah.
Like, so the way that I would think of infinity is that it's actually more along the order of an operation rather than along the order of a
like
number.
a number. Yeah.
So instead of it being a thing, it's an operation. It's like wherever you see infinity, it means that you could go beyond. Like there's always a way to expand the boundary, the border. You can always keep going. But
can I ask you a question?
Keep going. Right. Yeah. Go ahead.
It occurred to me that on that account, you might have an argument, an easier argument against an infinite past. The argument would be, if there could be an infinite past, then there could be an infinite number of events. But what you're saying is there's no such thing as an infinite number. There's only an operation. The operation operates on what exists to make it so there can always be more things. So there's the potential for more.
Yeah.
But there isn't actually a number that you could say that's the number. Like that's how many there are.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, this is the same intuition that would lead me to believe that it actually doesn't make sense. It's not coherent to think that there's an infinite past in the way that we're talking about this, in this scenario. But I think that there's another thing that is important to draw out here, which is that there's some sense in which the question of the nature of the present and the nature of the past and the nature of the future, like being, quote, infinite, like there's something there that people are grasping onto in their intuition, saying
that's what I was going to ask about then. What is that sense of like the prime number theorem, that there's an infinite number of primes, there's no highest prime.
So if you think of it in terms of your experience, and you say, in my experience, I can continue to look for prime numbers, and as long as I continue to look, I'll continue to find them, right? Because first of all, you have to ask yourself, are these numbers already in existence? Well, if so, where are they? And then you can say, well, I believe in Platonism. I believe in Plato's heaven. Like all the infinite numbers just exist.
They're in Plato's heaven.
They're in Plato's heaven.
They're all there.
Right? And so then, what you really have to grasp and ask yourself on the intuitive level, do I really believe that every single book has already been written, along with every single typo that had the potential to be created, along with every single sentence variation, along with every single, paragraph here or paragraph there, or every single rearrangement of chapters. And not only that, but all of the numbers, all of the concepts that could ever be thought. You could never create or discover anything because that isn't already there.
That isn't already there in some abstract form.
Exactly.
I mean, even if you have like all the numbers, then there's this additional number which numbers all those numbers, but then you need another number to number all those numbers plus that additional number. And then you just take all the abstract things, yes, and you have a proposition about them. Well, that proposition is one of the abstract things.
What if I have a thought about all of the abstract things? Then did I just create another abstract thing by having a thought?
Or was it already there?
Or was it already there? In which case, you have the Russell's paradox, you know.
Yeah. It's like included in itself. Yeah.
So anyway, I think that there's something that for me, like it causes me to really reevaluate even what we're talking about and what sort of a paradigm could account for our sense that there could be something infinite, right? So here's where
can I just share something for the audience? I hate to interrupt you, but no, just for the audience. So it's interesting, Rachel, because when we were dating at Notre Dame, we talked about infinity. And you said, I don't even know if there are infinities. And I said, well, there's got to be infinite number of possible worlds, and there's got to be an infinite number of numbers. I had no problem with infinities. And then even after the Grim Reaper paradox got me to really doubt, I mean, I was really thinking hard about whether there could be infinities of a certain sort, the causal infinities. But I still had no problem with abstract infinities. And so anyway, I just wanted to share that because my thinking on this has been I've been updating my thinking, and I feel like I'm appreciating your original kind of intuitions and questions. And it wasn't that you had sort of this definitive, clear thought about it. It was just that you just said, well, I don't really know. You know, you were kind of questioning, I think, maybe even what you were sort of just taught. Like there's no contradiction in mathematical infinities, so there's no problem with it. And you were just saying, well, on an intuitive level, I don't know if there really could be that much stuff.
Right. And also it goes against the intuition that something could be created. At least I have that intuition.
Something could be created.
That there's something that could always be recombined so that there's something new.
Yeah.
So anyway, so go back to the debates between you and Alex Proust over presentism and eternalism. And I think that there's something to be said about, you know, Alex would say something like, you know, it seems like there's some extension of a time. Like how long is a time? Like, you know, almost like, you know, you talk about like presentism implies that there's a time slice. Like how big is that time slice? And you're like, no, like that's putting the eternalist frame into the presentist frame.
That's right. You're reading your conceptual frame into presentism. Presentists don't think in terms of lengths of time. Yeah.
So anyway, so there is something though that I think that, you know, to give the benefit of the doubt. I mean, I think that actually probably a lot of people would have some intuition that would lend them toward eternalism, even if it's like, you know, maybe that was a religious teaching that was given to them, and so it like is a subconscious ingrained teaching, you know, God is outside
scientific
of time,
teaching,
or maybe, you know, so whether that intuition is arising from the gut level because of programming or because of, you know, it really emerging as like, oh man, I think that this is really, you know, they're touching reality in a certain way. We can debate that, but I think there's some sense in which you can really just compare. Like it does seem like experientially, subjectively, there are moments that feel like they last long and they're very drawn out, and then there are some moments that are very rapid. And it seems like there is something to that seems very strange if you imagine that everyone's reality is sort of just passing by, you know, in this objective frame, like, okay, here it is, pass, and everyone's just experiencing that in the same way. It feels a little bit like different from the way that we would normally experience time.
Yeah.
And you might have this question like, well, what is it? Is it presentism or is it eternalism? That's really true. And I just have this thought, you know, what if there's a certain sense in which both of them are true? So like, what if there really is, you know, you think about your first person sense of I. What if that first person sense of I is what it means to be present. So like, I have an experience right now. That is present. And that's the only thing that present could mean, is having an experience. So this would actually flip things around so that
experience is prior to time.
Subjects or consciousness is primary, right? So what if that is the frame? The present is right now. The present is my experience.
Your experience? What about my experience?
It could also be your experience.
Maybe
right?
it's anybody's experience. The general type.
Yeah. The general type of having an experience of existing or of being aware. And that is present. Now, what are you aware of? Now, here's where it's interesting, because now you bring in the concept of infinity, but in a different way. Because let's just say that I'm not looking behind me and outside my door. But let's just say that I go and I look outside my door. Suddenly, my experience expanded or changed, right? So let's just say that I want to, in this moment of my present awareness, I want to look into, or I want to move into, you know, some part of the past or some part of the future, right? There's some sense in which you can imagine logically that you could expand into those areas with your consciousness. Like we do this in our memory, in our imagination, right? So you could imagine logically that you could just continue to expand out the dimensions of that experience.
Yeah.
Right. And so then what you would actually have is you would have something like a dynamic reality that would be infinite, as in it would be able to be expanded in any way your consciousness wants to turn. It could expand, or it has already expanded because some other consciousness has gone there, right? Okay. You can argue like what that is, but you have some reality that is present, because the only thing that can exist is what's present.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's some sort of a reality that's present that can be expanded in any dimension that you want. So it can be expanded spatially, so you can look into bigger and bigger objects, and you might find that there continue to be bigger and bigger objects as you look for them. It could be expanded into smaller and smaller objects. You might be able to find, as you look, you might be able to find, oh, like we thought that this was the smallest particle. Oh, look, as we're trying to find,
it has a top half and a bottom half.
Oh, like look, there's another part of that particle.
Yeah.
And then you can look into the temporal map, and you can say, oh, I can expand into the past, and I can explore what's there, or I can expand into the future and see what's there. And that it's all happening in the present moment. Now, what does present mean? It means, again, like just redefining this frame. It has nothing to do with a time slice, or like, okay, we're going from this, you know, this moment to this moment.
It's experiential,
it's like
basically.
it's the experience. So if you take at the ground level that there's an experience, then you can look with an unbounded degree of freedom. You can keep looking in a certain direction, and there will always be something to be found. And if you think of it that way, then what you end up doing is you say, well, yes, there could be an infinite past. Yes, there could be an infinite future. Yes, there could be an infinite amount of space, but does it currently exist?
Could be, in the sense that you could always keep expanding, is what you're saying. Not that
if you think
you could have the whole thing already expanded, I think is what you're saying.
Yeah. So does it already exist? Like, what is it, right? Because infinity is not a number. So if you think of infinity as an operation, the operation would be an operation of expansion. So you continue to expand. So for example, the idea that there was a conscious, like, because then here's where the intuition happens, like, of, are you able to start an infinite sequence and finish it, you know, with your consciousness? And you might say, well, no, like that doesn't seem like you could ever finish. But could you, you know, start, or no.
If you don't start.
Could you finish if you don't start?
Yeah, right.
Then you're like, oh, okay, I guess that works, because you're thinking of that mathematical graph. But if
Yes.
you're thinking about it from the conscious subject first, then you would realize that that's already problematic, because you're basically saying that you didn't experience something. Like you're basically
Hmm.
saying like, oh yeah, like as long as I didn't start, like I didn't like, as long as I don't have like some experience, then like I can like finish an infinite series. But then it's like, well, what does infinite even mean? Like you're changing, you know, everything is getting conflated now. And so like
Yeah.
if you start to think of it like with the conscious subject first, then you can say, well, there's a certain sense in which we can actually move across um the landscape of time. If you imagine that there is a landscape of time, you can move across that landscape of time in a forward direction or in a backward direction, and that it can always expand. But does that mean that there are an infinite number of discrete events that have already happened? Well, I would argue that that is incoherent. So the idea is that we might not epistemically understand how many discrete events there have been, but that we might be able to just continue to look into them, and that there might be more advanced beings that have looked into more events, right?
Hmm.
And so like that's the thing where you know, and you can even imagine like, well, how many are there? Well, maybe it's always changing. I mean, because this really changes your way of
Yeah.
thinking of
Can I
reality, right?
translate
So
what you're
you
saying into my
imagine,
own terms?
yeah. So you imagine that shape, and this is the shape of the explored territory, and you just
Yeah.
imagine that that shape can grow in real time, like in the present, it can expand and it can grow in real time. So there's a sense in which that shape is like, you know, eternal, but it's also present. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, well, I was just thinking about what you're kind of saying in my own terms. It would be that there are different theories of time, and that there is a theory on which, let's say, consciousness is sort of prior to time. And then on that theory, it's hard to even conceive of an infinite extent of time. I mean, I guess maybe I would wonder, well, could you just have an infinite number of experiences? But maybe the idea is that if you sort of start with an experience of the present and everything else is potential. I don't know. I'm just trying to sort of translate the different theories, because okay, here's what I think is at stake is that I think that this Grim Reaper argument doesn't depend on your theory of time. So Proust, he's an eternalist, right? He comes up with this. Um, if you think of time as a dimension of space, you can still run the argument. If that
Yeah,
dimension goes out to infinity, then through recombination, you can get a contradiction. Contradictions are impossible. The recombination
right.
principle is intuitively plausible, independent of your theory of time. That's how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's the infinity, it goes out to infinity. What does that mean? I mean, because that's almost like a
So,
weird,
so maybe
you
what you're
know,
saying then is that there's a way of conceiving of infinity so that it maybe isn't explicitly contradictory in the concept. Um, it's kind of like what you said about a number. Like if there's an infinite number, there's not a contradiction in that. Even if you can turn that into a contradiction through recombination principle. But I think then you're saying something stronger, which is that um, your use of that recombination principle is already playing the game of a concept that you would even question that very concept. What
mhm.
you're saying, I think, is that this idea that time is like an extent that could go out to infinity, that very concept is, you're questioning the very concept. The
Yeah,
idea that there even is a number that could be an infinite number, like an infinite intensity.
yeah, exactly.
Mike Humer, I think he in his book he argues against these kind of infinite intensities, and you're agreeing with that, and you're saying that whole argument is in the wrong conceptual frame,
Right,
or it
right.
might be in the wrong conceptual
Because
frame.
the
Yeah.
way that you might then frame the presentism and the eternalism is actually in terms of events, or you know, the way that philosophers talk about possible worlds, or you know, parallel realities, or multiple universes, or you know, like you can start to expand out like, oh, what do you mean by, you know, we could visit like the past. And it's like, well, what if
Hmm.
you mean by the past actually is just you're able to see a sequence of events that was, you know, in a causal sequence prior to when I was just first thinking about it right now.
Yeah.
Right. And so then it's like, oh, okay, like there must have been some causal sequence prior to my focusing on this causal sequence that I'm seeing in progress. So then I can like move in my mental
Right.
landscape
You
to
can
this
go
other
back there.
thing called the event landscape. And
Yeah.
so then it actually is a different concept of like what we mean by time, because it's like if the only real time is your subjective experience, the present moment, then
Yeah.
it's like eternalism and presentism are actually arguing over something that is like, well, what is that? Like, like what
Mhm.
are we even arguing over? And so it's really a different way of thinking that deserves to be expanded a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is why I really wanted to have this conversation with you, because from our early conversations in graduate school, I would talk about certain philosophical frames. We would be debating the nature of possible worlds. And you would say, I don't even know if there are possible worlds. Or we'd be debating certain infinite sequences. And then you would say, well, I don't even know if that concept even makes sense. And it's also interesting because it's almost like what you're saying is that in order to even generate a scenario with an infinite past, there's other metaphysical assumptions and conceptual assumptions that might be presupposed that you would want to question those as well.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And I think that's very personally helpful to me. So thank you.
Well, and I mean, that's actually interesting because I don't think that that concept that I'm presenting is a standard scientific or mathematical concept. I mean, as far as I'm aware, the scientists that I know don't have any problem with infinity, or
Mm-hmm.
mathematicians, like maybe they have this weird, like this thought that infinities are weird when you try to apply them to the real physical world, but like they're a nice conceptual tool, but they don't have
Yeah,
any problem with thinking of it as,
even
in
a conceptual tool.
yeah. So I think that
Mm-hmm.
my thinking on it is a little bit different than a lot of the mainstream views.
I
But
think because you're thinking about how it would apply to reality. And once you do that, then you want to start thinking about, okay, well, what is it really?
mhm,
Not just what can I sort of make up in my head, but like what is it really and how could it actually apply to reality?
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All
and
right.
then
Well,
really trying to understand like what accounts for the experience, because it does seem like what accounts for someone, their experiences at the time just flew by, right? And then my experience is that, oh man, like I felt like time was just dragging, right?
yeah.
And it's like, well, what does that mean? Like, how can we even be in the same overlapping reality if you're having such a different experience than me?
Hmm.
And then it's like, oh, like, okay, like, even when you're talking about like Einstein's theory of relativity, it's like in a weird way, it's trying to get at it, but it's trying to almost like objectify, it's trying to objectify the idea like out in the world that this is what is causing
Out in
your
the world
perception to be
outside of
different.
experience.
Yeah. And it's like,
Yeah.
what if instead you just internalize it and you say, well, the difference is the subject, you
Hmm.
know, inside the subject, there's a perception, there's an awareness, and then that expands a whole other topic. You have your,
We could
well,
translate the equations in terms of the relativity of subjective experience.
and then
That would be related to space and time.
you can start to open up your conversation about panpsychism and panentheism and all these other things too, right? Because it definitely opens those up once you start using this as your frame.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'm going to keep thinking about it. I really do appreciate this. You know that I've been sort of waking up with thoughts, and I would share them with you, and then kind of tinkering with some thoughts. And so I wanted to sort of share my latest thoughts about how you can maybe set up this contradiction using this principle of recombination.
Sounds
So I'm
good.
going to
It
keep thinking about it. I appreciate it,
sounds
Rachel.
pretty
Thank you.
knocked down to me. Sounds pretty contradictory.
It convinces me. I mean, I just have to like be honest with my own self here that
Yeah.
I'm convinced right now. I could be wrong. I could be wrong, but I'm convinced that if there could be this infinite causal sequence, then through recombination, you can generate these absurd scenarios, not just like weird to my mind, but like absurd to the point of contradictory.
Hmm.
And I mean, so then this does take us back to the very opening question about, okay, well, if reality has a finite age, then what does that mean about the sort of initial point of reality?
Mhm.
And I think my thought currently would be that that initial point doesn't come to be, because that would imply being from non-being, which I don't think that's possible. So that initial point, whatever it is, exists. It didn't come to be, but it doesn't occupy an infinite number of distinct events.
Mhm.
That's where I'm at. So,
I
all right.
guess we are pretty much on the same wavelength.
Yes, until
So,
we get moved off through more reflection, which is possible.
right. That's right.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks,
Fun
Rachel.
conversation.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.